Chapter 13 of The Whistling Mountain by Mary Daem. They had already arrived home when the first of their company arrived. Far down the trail, somebody whistled, and David knew that it was Eric. He ran down the trail to meet him and tell him all about the fish he had caught, and the bear they had seen, and the mountain lion tracks. Eric had brought along his mother and his father too, and Mr. and Mrs. Dunn made them very welcome. The park superintendent and his wife and daughter came soon afterwards, the girls trying hard to remember their manners as they approached the cabin. David and Eric sat together on the steps and watched them coming. "Girls," Eric whispered in David's ear. "We didn't want any girls to play with." "I guess we've got to, though," David whispered back. "Their dad is my dad's boss." Eric wriggled uncomfortably. Surprisingly, the park superintendent wasn't old, as David had imagined his father's boss would be. He looked very handsome in his olive green uniform, and he had a big smile and eyes that twinkled with amusement. His wife was very pretty, and David was prepared to like her very much. But she spoiled things by patting his head and calling him sweet. One of the girls was David's age and the other a year younger. After they had been introduced, Elizabeth and Alice stood at the foot of the steps and stared. "David," Mrs. Dunn reminded him gently, "my mother says I have to show you around. Come on, Eric." He started off for the corral, and the girls walked woodenly behind. Mrs. Dunn began to talk rapidly to cover her embarrassment. The four of them stood at the corral fence and stared at the horses. The horses stared back. "See that stump in there? That big one." Two dark heads nodded silently. "I've been right up to the top of it, see?" The heads nodded again. "I could take you in there and let you climb it, only you can't because of the pack horses." Alice and Elizabeth spoke at once. Eric thought this so funny he began to laugh, and David and the girls joined in. One of the pack horses threw up its heels and galloped around and around, and the others spooked and began running too. Big John came out of the bunkhouse and shouted, "Hey, you kids, what are you doing? Get away from there." David and Eric began to run, and the girls raced after them. David showed them the creek, and they all played near it for a while. David told them about the porcupine and the tree that had fallen in the storm. They played a wild game of tag and a wilder game of run, sheep, run, only that wasn't so good because there weren't enough players. They were glad enough to sit on the back steps and eat some of the lunch David had intended to eat on the picnic. "Boy, this stuff is good," Eric exclaimed appreciatively. "Your mother sure can cook." He took another slice of cake and ate it fast. "We were going to eat this up the mountain," David stated flatly, "only we didn't get there. We had to come back to meet you people." "You didn't know I was coming," Eric challenged. "No, but we knew they were." David nodded at Elizabeth and Alice. Both girls immediately looked so unhappy that David was sorry he had said anything. He floundered for words to change the subject. "Do you know what?" he asked the girls. "I've got a mountain of my very own." "You have not?" "Yes, I have. It's that one up there." He pointed across the valley to where Mount Carmichael rose, serenely almost to the clouds. Nobody said a word. "It's my mountain because I named it and because I can see it from my bedroom when I lie in bed at night." Still no one said anything, and David wished he hadn't started. Do you want to know what I call it?" he asked, and Alice nodded. "I call it Whistling Mountain, that's what." "What do you call it that for?" Elizabeth asked. "Can't you guess?" Both the girls shook their heads. They'd begun to look interested, so encouraged, David plunged on. "I call it Whistling Mountain because my dad says there's marmots up there, and they whistle and whistle. I've heard one once, and I'd have heard more than one if we'd kept on going today." "Ah, who hasn't heard marmots whistle?" Eric said rudely. "When my dad takes me to get huckleberries, we hear all kinds of birds and animals, and we see them too." "But David never lived anywhere but the city before." Elizabeth rushed to his defense. "My daddy said so." "I'm going to climb that mountain right up to the top," David boasted. "Then I'll see those marmots too." "Who's going with you?" Eric asked skeptically. "No one, that's who. I'm going to go up there all by myself." "Oh, your dad wouldn't let you, on account of bears and things, and it's too far anyway." You've got to have someone with you when you go any place like that. Let's quit talking and go play hide and seek. Gee, there's lots of hiding places around here. David stood up in a hurry. He was glad they were going to stop talking. He'd talked too much as it was. And he was going to climb that mountain. He'd get right to the top, and that would show them. They chose a big fir tree as home base. And Eric was right. There were dozens of places to hide. The only trouble was they often went so far away that they couldn't hear the one who was it doing the counting. When the girls called out coming, they couldn't be heard at all. I've got an idea, Eric called when the game became too confusing. Let's not call ready. Let's just whistle like this. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out a whistle that could be heard half a mile away. Both of the girls put their fingers into their mouths and whistled nearly as loudly. But David just stood there. He knew it wasn't any use trying. He simply couldn't whistle. David, bring the children back now, his mother called. It's time for them to tidy up, and I've made lemonade for you all. David felt as though he'd been pulled back from the edge of a cliff, and that settled it. He'd have to learn to whistle, and the only way he knew that he hadn't tried before was to go to the top of his mountain and see how the marmots did it. That's the end of chapter 13.